Ellie, don't let them come near me.
The desperate whisper came from a man who had never begged for anything in his life. It was the first thing Eleanor Hayes heard when she stepped inside her home that quiet New Hampshire afternoon, and in that moment, the world she knew began to fracture. The grocery bag slipped from her hand and landed on the hardwood floor with a dull thud. Thomas Hayes, her husband of 40 years, was curled at the edge of the sofa like a man trying to disappear into the fabric. His shoulders shook in uneven spasms. His hands, once strong enough to build furniture from raw timber, now trembled uncontrollably in his lap. Eleanor had seen Thomas tired, frustrated, even sick, but she had never seen him like this. Not broken, not trembling, not afraid. His eyes were swollen and rimmed red, not with age, but with something closer to terror. The collar of his shirt was pulled out of place, as though someone had gripped him there. His breathing was shallow, uneven, like each inhale cost him more than the last. Eleanor moved cautiously, the way one approaches a wounded animal, slow, steady, careful not to startle him. When he lifted his gaze to her, the truth struck her before he ever spoke. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't illness. This was harm. He tried to form words, but his lips only quivered. His jaw tightened in pain or fear. She couldn't yet tell which, but the message was unmistakable. He needed protection. He needed her. The living room itself looked disturbed. The rug was skewed. A mug lay shattered near the fireplace, and one of the sofa cushions had been tossed onto the floor. Nothing about the scene suggested an accidental fall or a moment of forgetfulness. Eleanor felt a cold thread of dread lace up her spine. Before she could gather her thoughts, the front door opened again. Melissa and Jason stepped inside with a familiarity that should have comforted her, but instead filled the room with tension. Their arrival was too quick, their expressions too calm, their explanation too prepared. "We came as soon as we heard," Melissa said, her voice smooth but strangely practiced. Jason nodded. "He's been like this since morning. Must be some kind of confusion." Confusion. The word landed poorly, like a puzzle piece that didn't belong in the picture. Eleanor turned to her daughter and son-in-law. Melissa's posture was stiff, her smile forced. Jason kept his hands in his pockets, shoulders angled as if guarding information rather than sharing it. But the real warning sign wasn't their words. It was Thomas. Each time Melissa spoke, he recoiled slightly. Each time Jason stepped closer, his breathing faltered. Eleanor stepped between them, without fully realizing she was doing it. When she reached for Thomas's hand, he flinched. Not from her, but from the memory behind the bruising pressure still clinging to his wrist. She noticed the faint outline of a grip-shaped mark, dark and oval, the kind that didn't come from a simple stumble. Her heart tightened. Melissa saw the bruise at the same moment and rushed out a response almost too fast. "He must have hit his wrist when he fell. Mom, he's just confused." But confusion didn't leave a man afraid to speak. Confusion didn't rearrange the room. Confusion didn't make a proud, gentle man whisper a plea for protection. Eleanor straightened, her gaze sharpening as she studied Melissa and Jason. There was fear in Melissa's eyes, not concern for her father, but fear of something being uncovered. Jason's jaw twitched as if irritated Thomas hadn't stuck to whatever story they expected. The truth wasn't visible yet, but its outline hovered in the room like a shadow waiting to be recognized. Eleanor felt her pulse steady, not quicken. She wasn't panicking, she was waking up. Something had been done to her husband, something intentional, something meant to cow him into silence. She looked directly at Melissa and Jason, her voice low, controlled, and devastatingly clear. "What happened here before I walked through that door?" Her question didn't echo, but its weight changed the temperature of the room. Melissa stiffened. Jason looked away. Thomas closed his eyes as though bracing himself for the reaction he feared might follow. And Eleanor, for the first time in her life, felt a quiet but unmistakable shift inside herself. A line being drawn, a certainty setting in, a strength rising to the surface. Whatever this was, whatever had been done to Thomas, she would uncover it. And nothing, not fear, not lies, not family ties, would stop her. Eleanor guided Thomas toward the bedroom with the same care she once used when steadying her students during a storm drill. His steps were uneven, as if his legs were not entirely confident they could carry him. Every few feet, he paused, almost wincing, and Eleanor instinctively placed her hand near his back, not touching him, not wanting to startle him, just letting him know he wasn't alone. Sunlight streamed in through the hallway window, but the brightness only exposed more details she had missed in the chaotic moment downstairs. Thomas's shirt was misaligned. One side of his collar bent sharply inward, the other pulled wide, stretched as though someone had gripped it. His forearm, once thick with the strength of decades spent working with wood, looked tense and held tight against his body, like a man guarding a hidden pain. When they reached the bedroom, Eleanor lowered him gently onto the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped under his weight, and he let out a strained breath, the kind people release not from age, but from exhaustion tied to fear. It was when she reached for his hand that she saw it. A bruise. Dark, oval, unmistakably deliberate. It circled the top of his wrist like the mark left by someone's tightened fingers, the kind that dug in with intent rather than accident. The coloration wasn't random. It had a defined border, the shape of control and pressure, a grip that had not been gentle. Thomas tried to pull his hand away, not from her, from the memory. Before Eleanor could speak, footsteps approached the doorway. Melissa's voice entered first, too quick, too bright, too ready. "He fell earlier, Mom. On the stairs. He must have hit his wrist." The explanation came out before Melissa even saw what Eleanor was staring at. That was the first confirmation Eleanor needed. People who told the truth waited for the question. People who lied answered preemptively. Eleanor turned. Melissa stood with her arms crossed tightly against her chest, her shoulders raised just enough to betray tension. Her expression was neutral, almost impatient, as though this entire scene was an inconvenience rather than a crisis. Jason lingered behind her, leaning partially against the hallway wall, hands still deep in his pockets. His gaze flicked from the bruise to Eleanor, then to Thomas, assessing rather than caring. Thomas lowered his head, his breath stuttering, his fingers curled inward, hiding the bruise as best he could. Eleanor noticed the way his shoulders subtly rounded, the way his body seemed to collapse inward whenever Melissa and Jason moved closer. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't memory loss. It was fear conditioned by repetition. Eleanor waited in silence, letting it stretch long enough to reveal discomfort in the people who couldn't tolerate it. Jason shifted his posture. Melissa exhaled sharply through her nose. "Mom," Melissa said, "he's just having one of his episodes. Stress. Overthinking. We'll help you get him checked out." But stress didn't leave a man shaking. Overthinking didn't create the shape of someone's hand on a wrist. Confusion didn't rearrange the furniture downstairs. Eleanor turned her attention back to Thomas, her voice soft but steady. "Did you fall, Thomas?" He didn't answer. His eyes drifted toward the bedroom wall, focusing on a point that wasn't really there. His silence wasn't empty. It was restrained. Melissa stepped forward, too quickly. "Mom, he doesn't need pressure right now." Eleanor raised a hand, not to silence, but to pause. Her gesture was small, but it held authority that Melissa wasn't prepared for. Years of guiding anxious children had taught Eleanor how to command a room without raising her voice. It was a skill that didn't fade with age. She sat beside Thomas, careful not to crowd him. The bed creaked under her weight, and the familiar scent of cedar, embedded in the wood he had worked on all his life, rose faintly from the furniture he built. It was grounding, a reminder of who he truly was beneath the trembling. Thomas stared at his hands. Eleanor watched the way his fingers twitched every time Jason exhaled behind them. She noticed the subtle flinch when Melissa shifted her stance. And she realized something with chilling clarity. Thomas wasn't afraid of falling. He was afraid of them. A soft murmur drifted in from the hallway. Jason's voice, pitched low, but not low enough. "Didn't I tell you to keep it together?" The words weren't meant for Eleanor, but she heard them anyway. A small, sharp glance from Melissa toward Jason confirmed everything she had suspected. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, not from shock, but from recognition. She had seen children lie all her career. She had seen guilt twitch in their muscles before their mouths denied it. But this wasn't childish mischief. This was danger wearing the faces of family. She looked down once more at the bruise on Thomas's wrist. The shape, the pressure, the precision. Someone had held him there. Someone had forced him down. Someone in this house. Eleanor reached for a blanket draped over the foot of the bed and gently laid it across Thomas's legs, giving his trembling body some sense of warmth, some sense of control. Her movements were composed, almost ritualistic, even as her mind raced beneath the surface. She could feel Melissa watching her. She could feel Jason growing restless. Eleanor brushed her thumb lightly over the edge of Thomas's hand, just once, just enough for him to know he was seen. His eyes lifted, not fully, just enough to meet hers. Inside them lived an apology, a warning, and a plea. He wasn't ready to speak, but he didn't need to. The truth was already blooming in the silence between them. The light in the room shifted as a cloud passed outside, casting a muted glow across the walls. Dust motes floated lazily in the air, oblivious to the tension thickening around them. Eleanor felt her breathing deepen, her pulse steadying as a quiet determination settled over her. She rose from the bed with a controlled calm that unsettled Melissa more than any accusation could have. "We'll give him a moment," Eleanor said, her tone neutral but firm. She stepped into the hallway, positioning herself between Thomas and the people who had suddenly become strangers. Melissa's jaw tightened. Jason looked away first. Eleanor didn't need proof yet. She didn't need a confession. She just needed space to think. And in the stillness that followed, she made her first decision. Whatever had happened in this house, whatever fear had taken root in Thomas's body, she would uncover it, piece by piece, bruise by bruise, lie by lie. Nothing would remain hidden. Not anymore. Eleanor stepped out of the bedroom with the steady gait of a woman who had spent her life organizing crises for children who didn't yet know how to name their fears. But the crisis unfolding now was darker, older, and far more deliberate. She paused in the hallway, listening to the faint hum of the house, the refrigerator's steady vibration, the soft creak of the furnace cycling on, the distant rustle of pine branches outside. All these familiar sounds contrasted sharply with the unfamiliar dread she felt tightening around her ribs. She knew Thomas wouldn't be able to speak yet. Whatever had happened, whatever force had been used against him, had left him locked inside a shell of caution. If she wanted answers, she would need to gather them herself. Her eyes drifted toward the back door, the one leading to the small wooden shed Thomas had built a decade ago. It was his sanctuary, a place where the smell of cedar and varnish clung to the air, where tools hung in perfect order on the walls, and where time seemed to slow down enough for him to breathe. If something had shaken him this deeply, there was a chance the truth lived there. Melissa's voice floated from the living room behind her. "Mom, where are you going?" The tone carried polite concern on the surface, but underneath it, Eleanor detected the faint edge of control. Eleanor didn't turn around. "Just stepping outside for a moment." Jason's voice followed, firmer and less restrained. "Need any help?" "No." One word, steady, final. She walked out the back door before either of them could object. The crisp air hit her cheeks, carrying the earthy scent of wet leaves and early winter soil. The late afternoon light slanted across the yard, illuminating the shed like a quiet beacon. For years, she had viewed it simply as her husband's workspace. Today, it felt like a repository of answers. The wooden ramp creaked as she stepped onto it. Eleanor opened the shed door slowly, half expecting the room to feel different, darker somehow. But it greeted her as it always had. Shelves lined with hand tools, half-finished carvings, jars filled with nails sorted by size, and the old video camera perched on its tripod in the corner. Thomas had used that camera to record his work, mainly for his own amusement, sometimes to teach woodworking techniques to neighbors. He liked documenting processes, seeing progress frame by frame. If something had occurred here, the camera might have caught it. Eleanor approached it with cautious reverence, as though touching a fragile piece of evidence. She pressed the playback button and watched the small monitor flicker to life. A grainy but clear image appeared. Thomas sanding a wooden cabinet door, humming faintly. He paused occasionally to stretch his back, then returned to work. His movements were steady, unhurried, normal. She advanced the footage. The timestamp showed 10:14 a.m. Thomas was still working, wiping dust from the surface of the wood. Then the next segment jumped to 10:45 a.m. No transition, no glitch, just a clean cut in the timeline. Eleanor frowned and rewound the footage several times. The missing portion was precise. Not corrupted, not damaged, but removed. She pressed forward. The next image made her breath catch. Thomas was on the floor, his right arm angled awkwardly beneath him, his left hand braced against the wood as if he had tried to catch himself too late. His shoulders shook with the effort to breathe. His face, partially turned toward the camera, was contorted in pain and confusion. Then, movement entered the frame. A shape. A person. Jason. He stepped back from Thomas, shaking out his hand the way a man might after gripping something too tightly. His chest rose and fell with quick, controlled breaths. Not the panic of someone helping an injured man, but the composure of someone approaching a task with unwanted effort. His expression was blank, emotionless, calculated. He glanced toward the camera, not directly at the lens, but at the general direction, just long enough for Eleanor to understand something vital. He knew the camera existed, which meant he had also known how to disable it. Jason exited the frame briskly, as though he had somewhere else to be, as though nothing unusual had occurred. The footage continued for several minutes more, showing Thomas struggling to rise, gripping the edge of the workbench with trembling fingers. His breaths were jagged. His balance failed twice, before he finally pulled himself upright, swaying slightly. Eleanor pressed pause, her hand tightening around the camera. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a fall. This was violence, deliberate and controlled. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. She could feel the faint vibration of fear and fury beneath her skin, but she kept her breathing even, methodical. She had spent decades teaching children how to regulate their emotions. Now, she applied the same discipline to herself. She scanned the shed, recalling the numerous times Jason had insisted on helping out or checking in on Thomas's projects. Moments she once dismissed as gestures of involvement now looked like scouting missions. He had known this space well enough to manipulate it. Eleanor pressed play again. A faint sound reached the camera's microphone, shuffling, muffled voices, and then silence. The footage ended shortly after. She stepped back, her mind sorting through the implications like puzzle pieces, the precision of the missing footage, the bruise on Thomas's wrist, the tremor in his voice, the tension in Melissa's stance, and the flinch in Thomas's shoulders every time Jason's name entered the room. This wasn't a single incident. This was a pattern. A progression of pressure, fear, and control. She looked around the shed again, this time with a sharper eye. Thomas had always positioned a secondary camera high in one corner for overhead shots of intricate joinery. It blended so well with the rafters that most visitors never noticed it. Most visitors. Not Thomas, not Eleanor. But Melissa and Jason, they would have searched for the obvious one, the one on the tripod. Eleanor climbed onto a small step stool and reached up to the beam. Her fingertips brushed against a small camera, housing tucked into the wood grain. Cold metal met her touch, and when she lifted it down, she saw the faint red light blinking steadily. It was still recording. A wave of relief mixed with dread washed through her. This camera held everything the first one did not. She checked the memory card. The device had captured hours of footage, uninterrupted. Whatever had happened during the missing 45 minutes lived inside this tiny sliver of hardware. Eleanor slipped the card into her pocket, her hand closing around it with firm resolve. She knew better than to confront Melissa or Jason now. They were already performing, already shaping a narrative, already calculating their next move. She closed the shed door quietly, letting the cool air settle around her as she walked back toward the house. Dusk was beginning to gather along the tree line, casting long shadows that stretched across the yard. The house stood still, but it no longer looked like a safe place. At least not while Melissa and Jason were inside. Eleanor paused before turning the doorknob. Her heartbeat calmed. Her shoulders straightened. She now had evidence. She now had direction. She now understood the scope of the danger. But more important than any of that, she now understood that protecting Thomas would require more than comfort. It would require strategy. It would require patience. It would require exposing the truth one step at a time. With the memory card held tightly in her hand, she took a slow, steady breath and stepped back into the house, ready to face the next piece of the puzzle. Eleanor closed the back door quietly, the soft click sounding louder in her mind than in the room. Melissa and Jason were no longer in the hallway, but the tension they carried still lingered like humidity after a storm. The living room hummed with an artificial calm, the kind created by people trying too hard not to look suspicious. Eleanor didn't pause there. She went straight to the bedroom where Thomas sat on the edge of the mattress, shoulders rounded, staring at his hands as if they were foreign objects. The dim light from the small bedside lamp cast gentle shadows along the creases in his face, softening the deep worry lines that had appeared in recent weeks. His breathing was steadier now but still shallow, as if each inhalation had to fight through fear before reaching his lungs. Eleanor approached him slowly, mindful not to startle him. She sat beside him with a careful distance, close enough to offer comfort, far enough to give him space to speak if he could. The memory card in her pocket felt heavy, almost warm, as though holding proof carried a physical temperature. She didn't take it out, not yet. This moment was not about evidence. It was about trust. She knew Thomas needed to see safety in her presence before he could find the courage to speak. A kettle hissed faintly from the kitchen. Eleanor's hands moved automatically, the muscle memory of a long marriage guiding her motions. She brought back a mug of chamomile tea, steam curling from the rim. She placed it gently in Thomas's hands, guiding his fingers around the cup. His grip was weak but present. For a long moment, the only sounds were the soft hum of the furnace and the distant ticking of the hall clock. Thomas stared at the tea, then at the floor, then finally at Eleanor. His eyes carried the same plea she had seen earlier, but now something else flickered inside them, something like shame, something like apology. Eleanor kept her voice low, steady. "It's all right. Take your time." Thomas swallowed, the movement difficult. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if the words were too heavy to lift. His fingers trembled against the ceramic cup. Eleanor noticed the bruise more clearly now, the edges darkening, the imprint shaped unmistakably by force. He drew a slow breath, chest rising unevenly. He whispered, voice fractured like something cracked under pressure. Eleanor waited. She didn't touch him yet, knowing contact might overwhelm him. Instead, she simply remained present, a steady anchor in a room full of shifting truths. "They want the house," Thomas finally managed, each word pushed out as though it fought resistance on the way up. "They said it should be in their name. For the future." The word future came out hollow, stripped of hope. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She forced herself to breathe evenly, not wanting her rising fury to cloud his fragile courage. Thomas continued, voice trembling. They brought papers, told me to sign, said we weren't thinking clearly anymore. His gaze drifted toward the doorway as if expecting Melissa or Jason to appear. Melissa said it was the responsible thing to do. Jason said it didn't matter if we felt ready. It was time. Eleanor heard the unspoken message beneath the words. This wasn't persuasion. It was coercion. She leaned slightly forward. Did you fall, Thomas? He shook his head slowly, almost painfully. No. He pushed me. The confession came out in a thin, unsteady thread. I said no. And he grabbed my wrist. Hard. Then he shoved me down, told me it would be easier if I cooperated. A tremor passed through his body, subtle but unmistakable. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. She had suspected violence, but hearing it from him, hearing the humiliation, the fear, the betrayal, set something fierce and immovable inside her chest. Thomas's voice weakened further. I didn't tell you. I was afraid. Afraid he'd hurt you too, or come back. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her anger cooling into something sharper, more focused. She gently placed her hand over his, not squeezing, not forcing comfort, simply offering an anchor. You're safe now, she said quietly. I'm here, and I won't let them hurt you again. Thomas blinked hard, a tear gathering in the corner of his eye. It slid down his cheek with the weary resignation of a man who had held too much for too long. I didn't know what to do, he whispered. I kept thinking maybe it wouldn't happen again. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe... His voice cracked. But today he didn't even pretend to hide it. Eleanor nodded slowly. She understood. Many victims minimized what they endured, hoping it was temporary, hoping it was a misunderstanding. But violence rarely dimmed. It escalated. She reached into her cardigan pocket and closed her fingers around the memory card. She didn't show it to him yet, but its presence strengthened her resolve. We will handle this, Eleanor said, her tone gentle but underlined with steel. Not tomorrow, not someday, now. Thomas inhaled shakily, as though absorbing her steadiness into himself. A faint glimmer of relief softened the fear around his eyes, though the hurt remained. Outside, footsteps approached. Melissa's voice echoed faintly down the hallway. Her tone clipped. Jason's footsteps followed, heavier, more impatient. Eleanor placed the tea back into Thomas's hands. Drink this, she murmured with quiet intention. I'll take care of them. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't posturing. It was a promise born from necessity. As she rose from the bed, the weight of what she carried, truth, evidence, determination, settled into place like pieces of a mechanism aligning. Thomas was no longer alone in this, and Melissa and Jason had no idea how prepared she was to dismantle their lies. Eleanor waited until Melissa and Jason left the bedroom hallway before allowing herself to breathe more freely. Their footsteps receded toward the living room, followed by the low murmur of a whispered argument. The house felt tense, as though holding its breath along with her. She closed the bedroom door partially, not enough to draw suspicion, but enough to offer Thomas a buffer from the rest of the house. She needed space to think. Not just about what Thomas had said, but about everything she had seen in the shed, everything she suspected, and everything she now knew she must prove. The missing footage had been intentional. The bruise had been intentional. The fear in Thomas's eyes, intentional. If one camera had been tampered with, there was a chance Melissa and Jason believed they had destroyed all evidence. But they hadn't known Thomas as long as Eleanor had. They hadn't spent 40 years watching him innovate, adjust, and solve problems in ways that never left a trace of boastfulness behind. Thomas didn't brag, but he prepared. He always prepared, which meant the shed likely held more than one witness. Eleanor slipped out through the back door once more, moving quietly across the yard. The air had cooled significantly, carrying the crisp edge of evening. The sky above the tree line had turned a pale violet, and the first hints of frost glimmered on the grass. Her shoes crunched softly over the thin ice crystals, each step intentional. Inside the shed, she shut the door behind her and took a deep breath. The atmosphere was the same as before, sharp with the scent of sawdust and cedar, but now the room felt like a vault, holding secrets instead of projects. The workbench was neatly arranged, the tools aligned with practiced precision, contrasting sharply with the violence that had unfolded hours earlier. She went straight to the secondary camera she'd retrieved from the rafters. It was small, discreet, and designed to capture overhead footage. Thomas had installed it years ago when he started crafting more delicate furniture, experimenting with angles that required more detailed recordings. It had been recording for days, and judging by the blinking light, it had captured everything the tampered camera had not. Eleanor placed the device carefully on the workbench, unscrewed the panel protecting the memory card, and slid it out with steady fingers. She felt an odd sense of reverence, as though handling something sacred. In a way, she was. This little card held the weight of truth in a situation where truth had been manipulated, threatened, and silenced. She hesitated before inserting the card into the small portable viewer Thomas kept near his measuring tools. The hesitation wasn't fear of what she might see. It was fear of confirming the magnitude of the betrayal she was already beginning to understand. But there was no turning back. She powered the viewer on. The screen flickered, and the footage materialized. There was Thomas, moving slowly but peacefully, sanding a drawer front. He paused occasionally, humming softly, a tune she recognized from their early years together, back when he would whistle absent-mindedly while repairing things around their modest first home. Time moved forward on the screen. A shadow crossed the window, then another. Moments later, the shed door opened. Jason stepped inside first. He didn't call Thomas's name. He didn't greet him. He simply entered, closing the door behind him with a quiet, deliberate click. Thomas looked up, surprise flickering across his face. The camera angle made it possible to see the slight shift in his posture, the instinctive tightening of his shoulders. He said something, too faint for the microphone to catch, but the fear was visible even without sound. Jason moved closer, speaking in a low, controlled tone. The viewer captured only fragments, the cadence of accusation, the pace of someone issuing warnings rather than seeking conversation. Thomas shook his head. Jason stepped forward. On the screen, Eleanor watched him grab Thomas's wrist, and twist it with calculated force. Thomas gasped and stumbled backward, his hand reaching instinctively toward the workbench. But Jason didn't release him. He shoved him down. The overhead view capturing everything with clarity the first camera hadn't been allowed to preserve. The sight of Thomas hitting the floor sent a pang of nausea through Eleanor. Her hand instinctively covered her mouth, but she forced herself to keep watching. On the footage, Jason leaned down, speaking again, this time his lips forming words clear enough to interpret even without sound. Words about cooperation, words about making this easier. Words that stripped Thomas of autonomy and replaced it with threat. The worst part wasn't the violence itself. It was the coldness. Jason acted as though he were completing a business transaction rather than committing harm. A moment later, the shed door opened again. Melissa entered, her face tight with anxiety. Not for Thomas, but for the unfolding plan. She held a stack of papers, shaking them at Thomas with visible frustration. Her gestures were sharp, impatient, as if she blamed him for resisting. Eleanor watched as Melissa and Jason stood side by side, their attention wholly focused on forcing compliance. Thomas remained on the floor, dazed, bracing himself with one trembling hand. Then something chilling happened. The two began practicing their reactions. Jason rubbed his hands over his face as though wiping away imaginary tears. Melissa placed her fingertips below her eyes, testing how she might appear distraught. They choreographed expressions, exchanged glances, adjusted their tones, rehearsing grief the way actors rehearse lines. Eleanor felt her knees weaken. She braced herself against the workbench. She watched Melissa crouch beside Thomas, feigning concern, rehearsing the moment they planned to discover his condition. Jason joined her, nodding approvingly at their staged display. Then Jason walked toward the main camera mounted on the tripod and shut it off. But he didn't look up. He didn't see the second one. Eleanor exhaled shakily, the truth sinking deeper into her bones. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't a family dispute spiraling out of control. This was premeditated. She ejected the memory card carefully, as though it might break if handled too firmly, and slipped it into the inner pocket of her sweater. One card wasn't enough. If Melissa and Jason suspected anything, they would search the house. She needed redundancy. Eleanor gathered 2 spare USB drives from the drawer beneath Thomas's toolbox. She copied the footage to each one, watching progress bars fill with cold, digital certainty. When the process finished, she placed one drive beneath the lining of her coat pocket, sewing the inner seam with quick, careful motions, using the emergency needle and thread kept in Thomas's drawer. The second drive she slipped into a hollow space inside an unused clamp, a hiding spot she knew neither Melissa nor Jason would think to investigate. With the original card secured, Eleanor took one final look around the shed. This space, once associated with creativity and peace, now held the weight of betrayal. Yet it also held the evidence she needed. Evidence strong enough to protect Thomas from further harm. She stepped out into the cold air, the sky now indigo with the promise of nightfall. The wind carried a sharper bite, but Eleanor felt steadier than she had in days. Melissa and Jason believed they controlled the narrative. They believed Thomas's fear would silence him. They believed Eleanor's trust would blind her. They believed cameras could be switched off and truth erased. They were wrong. Eleanor walked back toward the house with deliberate steps, her mind no longer clouded by shock. The evidence existed. The pattern was clear. The betrayal was undeniable. All that remained was timing. And Eleanor, for the first time in a long while, felt the quiet strength of someone who could wait patiently and strike precisely. Tonight, she would safeguard the truth. Tomorrow, she would decide who deserved to see it. Morning came wrapped in a thin, pale light that made everything in the house look slightly drained of color. The quiet was almost deceptive. If a stranger had stepped into the kitchen at that hour, they might have seen nothing more than an older couple preparing for a day of errands. Coffee cups on the table, jackets on the backs of chairs, a faint radio hum in the background. But under that ordinary surface, something had shifted. Eleanor stood by the sink, watching steam rise from her mug. She had slept very little, though her body had lain in bed. Most of the night had been spent listening, to the creaks of the house, to Thomas's breathing, to the replay of images in her mind. Jason's hand on his wrist, Melissa's staged concern, rehearsed tears, forced explanations. The memory card lay hidden in a place only she and Thomas would think to check. The copied drives were tucked away in 2 separate spots, one in her coat, one in a place outside the house altogether. She had already made one silent trip just before dawn, stepping out under the dim gray sky to slip a small envelope into the mailbox of a neighbor who left early for work and never asked many questions. She didn't rely on luck. She relied on layers. At the table, Thomas sat in his usual chair, but nothing about him looked usual. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his fingers wrapped carefully around a ceramic mug he hadn't yet brought to his lips. The bruise on his wrist had deepened in color overnight, its outline sharper, more damning. Eleanor took a seat across from him, the wooden chair creaking softly. She spoke in a low, even tone. "We'll go in together," she said. "You won't be alone." Thomas nodded once, the movement almost imperceptible, but there. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, and in that instant she saw something fragile but important. A small return of trust, a flicker of resolve trying to stand up inside him. They didn't discuss the shed. They didn't mention the footage. They didn't need to. The decision had already been made. By mid-morning, Melissa and Jason arrived, right on schedule, as if they were keeping an appointment they themselves had arranged. Melissa walked in first, wearing a pressed blazer and a carefully chosen scarf that made her look professional and composed. Jason followed, tie tightened, hair smoothed back, the image of a man handling family business. He smiled too quickly. Ready to head to the bank? Eleanor noticed the way he framed the question. Not, do you want to go, but ready to. As if the choice had already been removed from the table. Thomas's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of his chair. Eleanor's hand rested near his, not touching, but close enough that he could feel her presence. We're ready, she answered. The drive into town was quiet. Trees passed by in a blur of bare branches and fading leaves. The landscape stretching out in muted browns and grays. The bank building appeared at the end of Main Street, with its brick facade and large glass windows that reflected the pale sky. It was a small-town institution, the kind of place where tellers greeted regulars by name and people believed paperwork represented trust. Today, it would represent something else. Inside, the warm air smelled faintly of paper, toner, and coffee. The carpet softened each step. Background music played at a low volume, blending with the murmur of voices and the rustle of documents. Melissa walked ahead, leading the way with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this entire scene in her head. A middle-aged man in a navy suit approached, his friendly expression shifting to polite concern when he noticed Thomas's unsteady gait. "Good morning, folks," he said. "How can we help you today?" Melissa answered before anyone else had the chance. "We're here about transferring the house and account authority." We spoke on the phone. The man nodded. "Yes, of course. Let's step into my office." They moved into a small room with a glass wall and a door that closed softly behind them. A desk divided the space, covered neatly with folders, pens, and a computer monitor. On one side, framed certificates hung in perfect alignment. On the other, a small potted plant drooped slightly toward the window. The banker gestured to the chairs. "Please, have a seat." Eleanor helped Thomas lower himself carefully into the chair beside her. Melissa took the seat closest to the desk, positioning herself where she could see the documents first. Jason stood for a moment, surveying the room, then leaned casually against the wall behind Melissa, as if he were there as support rather than pressure. The banker pulled a folder from his drawer and opened it. "So, as I understand it, there's a plan to transfer ownership of your home and adjust the power of attorney documents so your daughter and son-in-law can manage things more easily?" He spoke gently, as though this were a routine step in aging, a practical decision older couples often made. Eleanor watched Thomas. His breathing grew shallow again. His hand trembled against his knee. She turned to the banker, her expression calm. "I'd like to read the documents," she said. "Of course." He slid the papers across the desk. Melissa smiled tightly, her impatience barely concealed. Jason shifted his weight, folding his arms. Eleanor took her time. Her eyes moved carefully down each line, her lifetime as a teacher and meticulous record keeper guiding her attention. Legal phrases formed a structure she recognized all too well: relinquish, assign, authorize, grant, irrevocable. By the third page, one fact was crystal clear. If Thomas signed these papers, they would lose not just control of their home, but any say in how their remaining savings were handled. Their lives, in practical terms, would belong to Melissa and Jason. She lowered the paper slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle over the small office like a heavy curtain. "Melissa," she said quietly, without accusation, "this looks like more than just helping with bills." A flicker of annoyance passed over Melissa's features before she forced it into a semblance of concern. "Mom, it's just legal language. You know how these things sound worse than they are? It's to protect you and Dad. We talked about this." Eleanor turned to the banker instead. "Have you spoken directly with my husband about this, alone?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. "I spoke briefly with him by phone, but most of the details were explained by your daughter." Eleanor nodded slowly, the answer confirming what she already knew. She folded her hands in her lap, composing herself. Then she looked at Thomas. His eyes were fixed on the papers, but not with understanding. More like someone staring at an object that threatened to swallow them whole. His wrist twitched, the bruise visible beneath the cuff of his sleeve. Eleanor watched the conflict in his gaze, the old instinct to avoid making waves warring with the new fear of what would happen if he resisted. She leaned closer, her voice soft enough that it belonged only to him, yet steady enough that everyone in the room could hear. "Thomas," she asked, "is this what you want?" "Truly?" He swallowed hard. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air vent above them. For a moment, it seemed he might stay silent. Then his lips parted. "No," he said, the word hoarse but clear. "I don't." Melissa's head snapped toward him. "Dad, you're just confused. We already—" He raised his hand slightly, a fragile, trembling gesture that nevertheless carried a lifetime of earned authority. "I am not confused," he said, each syllable slow and deliberate. "They pressured me. At the house. I told them no. They didn't. Listen." The banker's expression changed at once. The polite neutrality left his face, replaced by something sharper, more focused, the look of a man suddenly aware he was standing in the middle of a situation that might require a report instead of a routine signature. But the words fell flat now. Eleanor kept her gaze on the banker. "My husband is telling you," she said calmly, "that he does not want to sign these documents, and that he felt pressured at home. That matters." It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact. Thomas took a shaky breath. "They grabbed my wrist," he continued, voice unsteady but determined. "Pushed me, told me. I didn't have a choice." The room grew very still. Melissa's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried to force a weak laugh that never fully formed. "Dad, that's not what happened." But the banker lifted a hand gently, his professional demeanor returning with a different edge. "I think," he said slowly, "we need to pause everything until this is clarified. It's very important that all decisions here are voluntary and free from pressure." Jason's jaw clenched. "Are you serious?" The banker nodded. "Completely." Eleanor watched it happen in real time. The first crack in their illusion of control. The story Melissa and Jason had tried to script began to unravel, not with shouting or confrontation, but with a single word from Thomas. No. For the first time since this nightmare began, he had said it where it mattered, out loud, to someone besides her. Eleanor placed her hand gently over his. This time, he didn't pull away. The banker gathered the papers and slid them back into the folder. "Nothing will be processed today," he said clearly. "If you decide to come back, we'll start from the beginning, and we'll make sure you both fully understand and agree. Together." Eleanor saw the rage flicker briefly behind Jason's eyes. She saw the panic tightening Melissa's mouth, but she also saw something else, the realization, dawning slowly, that they were no longer the only ones in control of the narrative. As they left the bank, the air outside felt colder, but cleaner somehow. The sky, though overcast, seemed more open. Thomas walked a little taller beside her, though the day had drained much of his strength. Every step was an effort, yet every step was also a quiet declaration. He had finally been heard. Eleanor walked at his side, her hand hovering near his arm in case he needed support. She knew this was not the end. It was only the first public crack in a structure built on lies. But cracks, once formed, had a way of spreading. And Eleanor intended to make sure this one did. The air in the Hayes home felt different when Eleanor and Thomas returned from the bank. It was lighter somehow, though the situation was anything but resolved. The confrontation had not ended the threat, but it had shifted the balance. Melissa and Jason no longer held the confident ground they had stood on for weeks. Instead, they walked through the house like people aware that the walls might be listening. And, in a way, they were. Eleanor had prepared for this moment with the precision of a woman who understood that safety wasn't guaranteed. It was built, step by patient step. While Thomas rested in the bedroom, She moved quietly through the house, checking the small recording devices she had placed earlier that morning. They were simple, discreet, each one no larger than a thumb, positioned in locations that blended so seamlessly with the environment that even someone searching with intention would struggle to notice them. She didn't place them out of paranoia. She placed them because she now understood the kind of people she was dealing with. People who rehearsed lies, people who staged injuries, people who pressured, threatened, manipulated, and people like that rarely accepted defeat cleanly. Eleanor knew Melissa and Jason would come back from the bank angrier, more desperate, more unpredictable. Desperation had a way of stripping away caution, and desperation, when combined with entitlement, often led to mistakes. She intended to capture every one of them. From the kitchen, she heard the front door open. Melissa entered first, her footsteps sharp, pacing like a caged animal. Jason came in behind her, his heavier stride matching the agitation in his voice even before words formed. "I told you to keep it together," he muttered, his voice low and edged. Melissa snapped back. "He blindsided us. You saw how he talked in there like we forced him." Jason gave a humorless laugh. "Because we did. But that's not the point. The point is he wasn't supposed to say it." Their voices drifted down the hallway, captured cleanly by the microphone hidden below the decorative bowl on the console table. One of many Eleanor had placed with the calm efficiency of a chess player positioning pieces several moves ahead. She remained out of sight, but close enough to listen, her ears attuned to every tone and inflection. "He's weaker than we thought," Melissa continued, her voice tightening. "I thought he'd fold under pressure. He always does. But Mom must have gotten to him. She's making him question everything." Jason scoffed. "Well, she's the problem then." Eleanor felt the words land like cold fingers around her throat, but she didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her focus, keeping track of their pace through the house as if mapping the route of a storm. Melissa moved into the living room, dropping her purse onto the sofa with a dull thud. "We can still fix this," she said. "We just need to find whatever made him so confident all of a sudden. Something changed." Jason's reply came from somewhere near the dining table. "It's her. She's been digging, asking questions, looking around." A pause. "And there was something off about the way she looked at the shed earlier." "The shed, of course." Melissa's tone sharpened. "You think she knows something?" Jason exhaled through his nose, the sound irritated and impatient. "I don't know, but if she saw anything, or if he told her more than he should have, we need to find it. Whatever evidence she thinks she has, it has to be in this house." There it was. The desperation Eleanor had been waiting for. She stepped quietly into the hallway just as Melissa and Jason ascended the stairs. They didn't notice her. They were too absorbed in their escalating panic, too convinced of their own cleverness to imagine they were walking straight into a carefully laid trap. Upstairs, dresser drawers opened and slammed, closet doors rattled, boxes shifted. The house shook beneath their frantic search. Eleanor stayed downstairs, listening as each thud, each muttered curse, each scrape of furniture found its way into the hidden microphones. The evidence built itself without her needing to lift a finger. Every sound was a confession. Every angry accusation they threw at each other etched the truth deeper into the record. "They're not stupid!" Melissa hissed from the landing. "They must have something. I swear, if Mom is hiding documents—" Jason cut her off. "Just check everywhere. They're old. They don't move things fast. It has to be here somewhere." Minutes passed. The chaos continued. Eventually, Melissa stormed back down the stairs, her breathing uneven, her expression tight with frustration. She moved quickly toward the back door, the direction of the shed. Eleanor followed silently, but kept her distance. When Melissa and Jason disappeared into the yard, Eleanor stepped to the window. The shed's lights flickered on, illuminating their silhouettes as they tore through drawers and tool chests, their movements jerky and frantic. They were no longer cautious. They were no longer composed. They were acting on raw instinct now, the kind that left a trail. Inside the shed, a second set of cameras installed earlier that afternoon captured everything. Not the overhead workshop cameras Thomas used, but Eleanor's own additions. Modern, discreet, and motion-activated. One hidden near the rafters, one concealed inside an old wooden crate, one positioned behind a row of paint cans, each one angled to record faces, movements, words. Tonight, Melissa and Jason would write their own undoing. In the yard, the cold air amplified their voices. "She had to have seen something," Melissa nearly shouted, her hands shaking as she pulled open another drawer. "Why else would he talk like that at the bank?" Jason's temper flared. "Then find the footage. That old man loves recording things. There has to be a backup somewhere." They rifled through everything. Tools clattered, papers scattered. Melissa's breathing grew harsh, verging on frantic. "It's not here," she finally said, voice cracking. "It's nowhere." Jason kicked a stool, sending it crashing into the far wall. "Then it's in the house, or she already has it with her." That was when Eleanor heard it. The shift from desperation to resolve, the dangerous kind. "Then we'll check again," Melissa murmured. "We'll go through everything until we find it." Eleanor stepped away from the window, her pulse steady, not from calm, but from certainty. She walked back into the living room, her movements composed, her expression unreadable. The recorders were still running, documenting every word spoken outside. Everything she needed for the next phase was unfolding exactly as she had predicted. Later that evening, after Melissa and Jason returned inside with empty hands and simmering frustration, Eleanor called the one person who needed to hear everything. Dr. Karen Lowell picked up on the second ring, her voice professional, warm, and immediately attentive. "Eleanor," she said, "I've been expecting your call." Eleanor's reply was soft but unwavering. "It's time." Karen listened as Eleanor described the bank incident, the threats, the recordings, the shed. She didn't interrupt. When the explanation was finished, the lawyer's voice held the confidence of someone already fitting puzzle pieces into place. "You've done exactly what you needed to do," Karen said. "You've gathered proof, you've documented behavior, and you've allowed them to reveal their intent themselves." A pause. "We're ready for the next step." Eleanor exhaled, a slow, steady breath. Outside, Melissa and Jason were arguing again, unaware of the tightening circle around them. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt her fear loosen its grip. Not because the danger had passed, but because she was no longer reacting. She was leading. Melissa and Jason believed they were hunting for secrets. But they didn't realize they had already delivered every secret Eleanor needed, straight into the hands of the law. And tomorrow, patience would turn into consequence. The next morning arrived without ceremony, bringing with it a thin layer of frost across the yard and a pale sky that held no warmth. Eleanor woke early, not from rest, but from purpose. The events of the previous day, the frantic search, the shed intrusion, the whispered panic, had confirmed that the moment to act had come. Evidence alone was powerful, but a confession, willingly given, carried a weight no courtroom could ignore. She brewed tea quietly, letting the steam drift upward as she planned each step. Thomas remained asleep in the bedroom, his breathing slow and even, the first peaceful rhythm she had heard from him in days. She did not need him awake for this part. Today's task was hers alone. By mid-morning, Melissa answered Eleanor's message with surprising speed. "I'll come by. We should talk." The message was curt, clipped, written by someone who believed she still held leverage. Eleanor recognized the tone. It was the voice of a daughter confident that she could regain control through charm, logic, or pressure, whichever worked fastest. But Melissa had no idea how much of herself she had already revealed. Eleanor prepared the house with quiet efficiency. The recording devices from the previous night had captured hours of incriminating behavior, but she wasn't relying solely on them. Today required precision. She checked each device again, confirming battery levels, testing signal strength, adjusting angles. One behind the framed family photo on the mantel, one beneath the table runner, one inside the hollowed spine of an unused cookbook. Their placement looked so natural that even Eleanor could barely spot them herself. Then she waited. When Melissa arrived, she entered without knocking, her heels striking the entryway floor with the confidence of someone stepping back into familiar territory. Eleanor watched from the living room, observing the subtle details, the too straight posture, the tight jaw, the way Melissa scanned the room as if trying to assess whether anything had shifted overnight. Her expression softened artificially when she turned toward her mother. "Mom," she said, her voice light but strained at the edges. "We need to clear the air." Eleanor gestured to the sofa. "Have a seat." Melissa sat, crossing her legs with a practiced elegance. The pose was rehearsed, the demeanor curated, but her eyes betrayed tension. A flicker of uncertainty, a need to measure the battlefield before stepping further. Eleanor remained standing for a moment, letting silence settle around them like dust. She had learned long ago, as a teacher, that silence had power. People rushed to fill it, often revealing more than they intended, and Melissa was no exception. She exhaled sharply. "I know yesterday didn't go well. Dad was confused. You were emotional. Jason was frustrated. But we can still fix this if we all stay rational." Eleanor said nothing. Melissa continued, her words coming faster. "It shouldn't have escalated the way it did at the bank. He just panicked. You know how he's been lately. Memory issues, decision fatigue. It's normal at his age." Still, Eleanor remained quiet. Melissa shifted, her knee bouncing once before she caught herself. "Look, the house transfer is necessary. You and Dad can't manage things alone anymore. We're trying to make your lives easier." Eleanor finally moved, taking a slow seat across from her. She kept her tone gentle but unwavering. "Melissa," she said, "why did you push your father to sign papers he didn't understand?" The question struck like a sudden gust. Melissa blinked rapidly, recalibrating. "I didn't push him," she replied with mild indignation. "I encouraged him. There's a difference." Eleanor held her gaze. Why did Jason twist his wrist? The flicker of panic was instantaneous, a crack in the polished veneer. Melissa's lips parted before she could hide the reaction. "He didn't." The denial came too quickly, too practiced. "You misunderstood what you saw." Eleanor let the weight of the moment settle. "I didn't say I saw anything." Silence. Melissa's breath caught in her throat, a tiny, almost inaudible hitch that no untrained ear would detect. But Eleanor heard it. The recorders heard it. And Melissa, realizing what she had revealed, tried to recover. "Mom, listen," she said, leaning forward. "We're doing what's best for you and Dad. Maybe it got tense. Maybe things weren't handled perfectly, but you're blowing this out of proportion." Eleanor watched her daughter's face carefully. The desperation had resurfaced. The same desperation that drove her to tear through drawers and search the shed in the dark. The same desperation that loosened her tongue. "Why were you in the shed last night?" Eleanor asked calmly. Melissa's posture stiffened. "I wasn't." "You and Jason turned on the lights at 11:17 p.m., Eleanor replied. The house, the yard, the shed, everything had been far less private than she believed. Her voice dropped. "Mom, what are you saying?" Eleanor leaned back, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "I'm saying I want the truth. From you." Melissa swallowed, her breath growing uneven. Her composure frayed like fabric pulled too tight. She rubbed her palms together, a gesture Eleanor recognized from childhood, the one Melissa used when she felt cornered. "I didn't want to push him," she murmured. "But we didn't have a choice." There it was, the first real crack. Melissa continued, words spilling out now with a momentum she couldn't stop. "Dad doesn't understand how complicated things are, the debts, the business falling apart. Jason is barely keeping everything together. We needed the house to stabilize things, just until we got back on our feet." Eleanor's expression did not change. "You hurt him." Melissa shook her head, but the denial lacked conviction. Jason handled it wrong. Okay? He gets impatient, but Dad wouldn't listen. He kept saying no, and we needed him to see reason. Reason? Eleanor echoed, her tone low. You call that reason? What were we supposed to do, Mom? Let everything fall apart? Let Jason lose everything? Let me clean up the mess alone? Dad wasn't thinking clearly. We just helped him understand what needed to be done. She froze as soon as the words left her mouth. Her eyes widened. Her face paled. Because she heard herself. She heard the confession. Eleanor did not need to point to the recording devices. Melissa realized, slowly, painfully, that every word now hung in the air with a permanence she could not erase. A knock sounded at the door. Firm, measured, official. Melissa turned toward the entryway, panic flooding her features. Mom! Mom! What did you do? Eleanor rose calmly. What had to be done? Footsteps entered. Uniforms came into view. Melissa's breathing quickened as two officers stepped forward, their expressions solemn but steady. Melissa Carter? One asked. Her voice broke. Wait, this is a misunderstanding. But it was no longer in her hands. Jason, drawn by the commotion, stumbled into the room from the kitchen, eyes wide. What's going on? The officers didn't have to answer. The truth was already unraveling around him. Eleanor stood still, a quiet pillar in the center of the storm. She watched as handcuffs clicked shut, as Melissa's frantic pleas dissolved into sobs, as Jason's anger faltered into fear. The trap had not been set out of revenge. It had been set out of necessity. And today, it had sprung exactly as intended. The courtroom carried an atmosphere different from any other space Eleanor had stepped into during her long, quiet life in New Hampshire. It held a gravity that pressed gently on the skin, a subdued hum of anticipation that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. The rows of benches were filled with quiet observers, community members, advocates for elder protection, a few curious townspeople who had heard whispers about the case. Their faces were somber, watchful. Eleanor and Thomas sat together at the front, their hands resting close, but not intertwined. Thomas's wrist had healed enough that only a faint shadow remained, but the emotional bruise lingered in subtle ways. His shoulders tense, his jaw set in a tight line, his eyes tracking every movement in the room as if assessing possible danger. Yet, beneath the tension, there was a new steadiness, a kind of reclaiming. Across the aisle, Melissa and Jason sat with their attorneys, their expressions drained of the arrogance they once carried so easily. Melissa's hair was pulled back sharply, but the attempt at composure did little to hide the exhaustion etched into her features. Jason looked smaller than Eleanor had ever seen him, his posture slumped, his confidence stripped away. They avoided each other's eyes. Silence loomed between them like a wall neither dared cross. When the judge entered, the room rose in unison. He was a deliberate man, with a calm but discerning gaze that swept across both sides before he took his seat. Eleanor felt the air shift, as if the proceedings had truly begun only once he settled behind the bench. The prosecution began by presenting the timeline, the financial strain Melissa and Jason were under, their deliberate planning, their increasing aggression when Thomas resisted. Then came the videos. Each one played on the screen with clinical clarity. The footage from the shed, the torn drawers, the frantic search in the dark, the audio recordings capturing their whispered frustrations and planned coercion, and then, the most devastating piece, the confession in Eleanor's living room. The court watched in utter silence as Melissa's recorded voice filled the room, admitting just enough truth to destroy any plausible defense. Her attempts to frame manipulation as reason, her justification of physical force, her insistence that she and Jason had no choice. The words struck with a precision no prosecutor could match. Melissa's shoulders shook slightly. She kept her face turned downward, her eyes fixed on the table before her. Jason shifted restlessly, his jaw tightening in rhythm with the damning evidence. Every new video made him flinch, as if each one peeled back a layer he had spent years constructing. When the recordings ended, there was a long pause. The judge folded his hands, his expression unreadable. He allowed the silence to sit, to settle, to sink deeply into the room. Finally, he spoke. His voice was measured, neither harsh nor emotional, but carrying a gravity that pressed into every ear. Cases involving family are often the most painful to evaluate, he began, because they reveal what human beings are capable of when loyalty and love are twisted into tools for control. He turned slightly toward Melissa and Jason. This is not merely a matter of financial misconduct. This is a calculated attempt to exploit vulnerable adults. It involved deception, coercion, and physical harm, and it relied on the silence and trust of the very people who raised you. Melissa closed her eyes. A tear slipped free, tracing a thin line down her cheek. The judge's gaze sharpened. It is the responsibility of this court to protect those who may struggle to protect themselves, and in this case, that duty is clear. He lifted the sentencing document. For the charges of elder coercion, fraud, attempted unlawful transfer of property, and physical intimidation, Jason Carter, 10 years incarceration with no possibility of reduction for the first 4. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Jason's attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but he remained frozen, staring forward as though unable to process the words. His face drained of color. The judge continued. Melissa Carter? 7 years incarceration, along with a permanent order barring any direct or indirect contact with Eleanor or Thomas Hayes. This includes physical proximity, written communication, and financial involvement. The air had been pulled from her lungs. Her shoulders curled inward, and she pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. It was not the cry of a woman wrongfully accused. It was the sound of someone finally recognizing the full weight of their own choices. Eleanor watched her daughter, not with triumph, not with spite, but with a quiet, mournful resignation. She had once imagined Melissa's adulthood would be filled with promise. She had once believed her daughter's confidence came from ambition, not entitlement. The grief of that misconception sat heavily in her chest. When court was adjourned, the room began to stir. Officers approached Melissa and Jason, guiding them gently but firmly to their feet. Their hands were cuffed. Their steps were slow. Eleanor observed without flinching. Justice was not meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be truthful. As the two were escorted toward the exit, Melissa lifted her eyes for just a moment. She looked at her mother, really looked, and something in her expression flickered between regret and disbelief. But Eleanor offered no nod, no gesture of reassurance. She simply held her gaze, steady as stone, until Melissa lowered her head again and was led away. When the doors finally closed behind them, a hush fell over the courtroom. Slowly, people began to file out, their expressions thoughtful, some offering sympathetic glances toward Eleanor and Thomas. A few approached briefly, offering quiet words of support, but it wasn't until the room had nearly emptied that Thomas reached for Eleanor's hand. His grip was soft, yet certain. "We did it," he murmured, though his voice barely rose above a whisper. Eleanor turned toward him, her eyes softening. "Yes," she said. "We did." They walked out of the courthouse together, the crisp air brushing against their faces. The sun had climbed higher now, its light thin but sincere as it warmed the steps beneath their feet. Cars passed slowly along the street. Life continued, indifferent to the battles waged within courtrooms. Back home, the house felt different again. Not lighter, not heavier, but steadier, as though the walls themselves recognized that something had been restored. The teapot whistled softly on the stove, and Eleanor prepared 2 cups while Thomas settled into his familiar chair with a long exhale. They sat together in the quiet, each holding a warm mug between aging hands. The world outside remained uncertain. Age, memory, and the passage of time would still bring their own challenges. But they had reclaimed something irreplaceable, their voice, their dignity, their home. For the first time in many months, Eleanor felt the weight lift. Not entirely, but enough. Enough to breathe deeply. Enough to recognize that the life they nearly lost had been returned to them. And for this moment, at least, they were unshakably whole.